Hi, so we're gonna get started. So this is the Building Relationships with Faculty, and I'm a peer advisor, and my name is Lola.
Hi guys, I am also a peer advisor. My name is Liliana, and we got a great presentation coming for you today about building relationships with faculty. So, with that, I will pass it over to Saskias Casanova.
Hi, everyone. My name is Saskias Casanova. I'm a professor in the social psychology area of our department. Some of the classes that I teach include qualitative methods, Latinx psychology, and psychology of immigration, which is a senior seminar. And my lab is called the Migration Identity and Education Lab, or MIEL. And our research goals really focus on understanding the learning experiences and psychological processes of, in particular, students of color and immigrant origin students. Really, I focus broadly from a social psychological perspective on how social identities and social identity development in the context of them being intersectional really impact the learning experience of folks. And so specifically, I am interested in the understudied identities of people that are maybe stigmatized or may come from a different country, or their parents may come from a different country, so immigrant origin, and how that adaptation happens in the host country, or as they are navigating multiple cultures and their multiple identities. I also focus from a strength-based perspective on these experiences. So I don't only want to look at how systems and institutions create sometimes barriers, but I also like to understand how these students in particular use their cultural capital, their social, their community cultural wealth to counter barriers that they may face, so they can feel a sense of belonging, and ultimately really my most of my projects are what's called community engaged, and that means that we partner with schools, with nonprofit organizations, and we really try to get our research out to and not just for it to be knowledge creation, which is really important, but also for that knowledge to change practices and systems with our community partners. So ultimately, we really want to create evidence-based practices and policies that transform educational systems. So what we do in our lab, if you were to be part of this particular lab, you would focus, and this is generally not just this lab, but a lot of labs usually require students to do reviews of literature. You help with the institutional review board protocols, or the IRB, which is a process that research studies have to go through in order for them to be able to be conducted, and it's for creating an ethical process for the research studies that we conduct at universities. A lot of the time, my students right now, because I'm mostly working on projects that are participatory and in the field, they the students will do qualitative type of work. So they'll learn how to create and how to collect semi-structured interviews with participants or focus groups. We're in the classroom a lot because we do a project focused on youth participatory action research. And so undergraduates go into schools and they conduct field observations and collect field notes, data, but we also collect surveys as well. So sometimes the undergraduates that work in my lab will use SPSS, for example, to help with the quantitative survey data, organizing, cleaning, and analysis. And ultimately, I think one of the biggest takeaways from being part of a lab like Miel is really to think about the research as part of a broader process of action. Again, like I mentioned earlier, we disseminate our results to our community partners first and foremost. So sometimes we do infographics or zines for our community partners, but we also present the work to other academics. So undergraduate students, when they're in an advanced research, meaning they've been in the lab for a few quarters, usually more than a year, they have opportunities to present the research as well. And so I have a little scan me over there if you're interested in this lab, but also as part of this panel, right, just if you're interested in talking more about any of these topics with me or connecting with me as a faculty here.
Thank you so much, Professor Casanova. All right, we will. There's one more slide. Oh, yeah, so sorry.
Oh yeah, that should have been at the end. It's like for all of us to talk about, but that's okay. Do you want me to talk about it right now? Because that's just
We can go back to this.
okay.
Yeah, we can go through all the professors first. Thank you so much,
Yeah,
though.
so as introductions.
Yeah, totally. All right, perfect. I will pass it on to Adriana Manago. Oops, sorry.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm Dr. Adriana Manago, and I run the Culture and Technology Lab, the CAT Lab. And we're really interested in how, yeah, information and communication technologies shape human development. We focus specifically on adolescent development and the transition to adulthood. And some of the topics that we study are social development, identity development, identity and values, gender and sexuality, different types of social connections, how networks and social relationships are changing with the increasing permeation of digital technologies in everyday life. I got started on this work not so much by being interested in technology, but by being interested in cultural change and the ways that adolescents mediate cultural changes in their communities. So it's often the case that adolescents are sort of like the pioneers of new digital technologies or new forms of being new technologies that are coming into a community. My research on cultural change began when I was a graduate student, and I was studying cultural change in an indigenous Maya community in southern Mexico called Zinacantan. And at that point, this is, yeah, in the early 2000s, high school was new in the community. A new high school had been introduced by the Mexican government in this indigenous community. So I was studying how that high school was shaping gender roles and gender relations. So for the first time, boys and girls were going to school together, doing the same kinds of tasks in order to transition to adulthood. They were socializing without parental supervision, for example. So while that was happening, MySpace was sort of the first big social media, social networking site that came on the scene in the United States. So then I started to study high school as a motor for change in this indigenous Maya community, and then social media as a motor for cultural change here in the United States. And so, yeah, over the past, 10, 15 years, we've been mostly focusing on social media and how adolescents use social media and how their cultural communities shape how they use social media. So many developmentalists that study social media they tend to look at the outcomes of social media on, certain kinds of well-being outcomes, loneliness or life satisfaction or mental health issues. We take sort of a different approach where we try to understand what shapes how adolescents use social media in the first place. So family environments or individual characteristics, how gender identity might shape how you use social media. So rather than just blaming the technology itself, we try to consider the cultural contexts that are shaping, uses and outcomes of social media. And we try to take a balanced approach, looking at both the opportunity and risks of different technologies. Now, with AI coming on the scene, I think many of us in the lab are sort of interested in thinking about that as a motor for cultural change as well. So if you're an undergraduate in my lab, you might be involved in literature reviews, many of the same things that Dr. Casanova talked about, literature reviews, managing data in SPSS. We do a combination of quantitative and qualitative research One of the things that we have done that has been really fun is we do these social media tours. So we have adolescents give sort of like bringing the internet into the interview. So we hook up the adolescents' devices to a recording device to a desktop, and we have them walk us through their different social media platforms, what they express, how they use it, how they construct themselves, their identities online. So we get a sense of like we can look at what's actually happening online, what they've actually posted, what the interactions, and then we also get their interpretations. So these are called digital media tours or social media tours. And so adolescent undergraduates have been really helpful in recruiting participants. Some of them have even conducted those interviews, but they've been also very much involved in coding and analyzing those interviews. Oftentimes, undergraduates make a really great contribution to our lab because you're all often on the cutting edge of social media use as well. So you often have insights into peer culture and youth culture that can really enhance the qualitative analysis. Yeah, and then we um, also try to get undergraduates involved in presenting some of their research in undergraduate directed kind of conferences, like at San Jose State and here at UC Santa Cruz. And the way that I usually recruit is often I just recruit students from my classes. We'll maybe talk about it today with building relationships with faculty. When I see students really engaged in their learning, really excited about their learning, wanting to know more about the topics that we talk about in class, like my Intro to Developmental class or my Cultural Perspectives on Adolescent Development seminar or my Psych 116 class, it's all about communication technologies and development. So I'm often recruiting from those classes, but I also sometimes just get emails from students who are interested. And if you are interested, it's great to just hear a little bit about, why you're interested in this kind of research, your goals for the future, what kinds of career are you looking at, what kinds of timeline do you have to participate? And then I do have kind of a formal application that I have undergraduates fill out, and then we do an interview to make sure that it's a right fit. And yeah, the longer that you stay in the lab, the more that you can get involved really in conceptual contributions to the research, meaning that you might even be able to get be an author on a paper and so forth. That takes a little bit of time to be really to get really involved in different research projects that are happening in the lab. So yeah, looking forward to hearing your questions and talking with everybody further about building relationships with faculty.
Thank you so much. And there will be a Q&A at the end where students will have an opportunity to ask questions. All right, I'll pass it on to our last presenter.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nick Davidenko, and I lead the high-level perception lab. So I'm a professor in the cognitive area of psychology, and I'm interested generally in perception. Mostly, I study visual perception, but in the last few years, I've been sort of looking at also auditory perception and how we perceive our bodies in space. So that involves vestibular perception. And I'm interested in um, things beyond sort of the low level um, things that are happening at the level of the eye, and more interested in how the brain processes and combines different types of inputs. So one of the things I study is perception of complex information like faces, objects, scenes. One of our research studies is looking at how people perceive emotional expressions in faces, like what areas of the faces are most informative, what are some individual factors that might affect performance and reaction time in face-related tasks. I also am interested in how different senses interact with each other. So I have a few different projects that look at auditory and visual inputs and how they can interact and be integrated. So one of our projects looks at misophonia, which is a condition where people have very averse negative reactions to certain trigger sounds. And we're looking at not just how sounds can trigger those reactions, but also the role of visual information and how visual information can modify how people interpret and react to sounds. And I'm also really interested in how top-down factors like attention, expectations, or language or knowledge can bias our perception. So a lot of our studies present participants with ambiguous information, and we look at different ways in which we can bias the way people resolve ambiguity. So one example is what's flashing there in the lower left-hand corner of the slide. It's not a QR code. It's actually one of the stimuli in our studies. And if you look at it while I continue talking, you might start perceiving certain motion patterns in that stimulus that turns out that can be really easily manipulated by external factors. So if I, for example, say up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, many of you will start seeing up and down motion. And if I switch to saying right, left, right, left, right, left, right, left, then a lot of you will switch over to seeing right and left motion. In fact, those pixels that you see are completely random, and it's just your brain that is somehow organizing that information and finding or sort of constructing patterns out of that randomness to the point where people believe that they are actually seeing things that their brain is actually constructing. So we use a lot of different methodologies. Primarily, we use behavioral experiments in our lab. So participants come in and sit in front of a computer and look at images like this, or put on headphones and listen to sounds, while watching videos. And we record things like reaction time and choices that people make, performance in certain tasks. We also use eye tracking technologies, so we can look at where people move their eyes when they're perceiving things and looking at faces or looking at other stimuli. We have some studies using virtual reality where we've investigated things like time perception and how different orientation cues affect our sense of space. And we also do some computational modeling in my lab. So students who come in with some computational background, having taken some programming courses or statistics courses, can contribute in other ways. So generally speaking, I recruit research assistants mostly through exposure to the research topics that I teach in my perception course, as well as in my illusion seminar. But very often I get emails from students, and that's how I make the initial contact, by them reaching out to me to express interest in some of the work I'm doing. And research assistants, when they first join the lab, they're mostly involved in helping to run experiments. And the way my lab works is all the RAs get trained on all of the studies so that we can kind of run studies as we need. And that has the additional benefit, I think, of exposing research assistants to lots of different studies and not just the one that they're most involved with. But in addition to kind of running general studies in the lab, over time, RAs also get more involved in studies, can help with some of the data coding, or pitch into new experiment designs, contribute to literature reviews, and often become co-authors of papers and presentations. So if anyone is interested in my lab specifically, or I think this is probably a general comment, is to familiarize yourself with a little bit of the research that in my lab or in another lab that you're interested in contacting. So most professors will have a web page with publications, and that's a good way to kind of get a sense of what's the latest research they've been working on, and then reach out with an email to schedule an interview. And like Adriana said, including things like your timeline, or where you are in your degree, or what you want to do after college, or specifically why you're interested in that lab. Those are really good things to mention in an initial email. And then be patient. Sometimes faculty don't get back right away, and that's not to be taken personally, but just the busy things that we're doing. And we do get a lot more contacts than we are able to recruit. So typically recruiting happens at the beginning of each quarter, and really big in the beginning of fall. So just keep that in mind. But yeah, that's generally what my lab does and how to reach out if you're interested.
Yeah, and I think just generally speaking, I know each of us have mentioned a little bit of how to reach out regarding our research and our lab, but in general, I think even oftentimes when you are not sure if you want to pursue research or if you have other reasons for contacting faculty or connecting with network with your faculty networks or your research networks, just like my colleagues have said, you want to do a briefly introduce yourself via email. Um, I know both Dr. Manago and Dr. Davidenko have mentioned you may want to read a paper, an article or two about the work that the faculty have been doing, or look at their website. And really, it's important for you to also describe what you're interested in, why you're emailing us, right? So you would want to be as clear as possible in terms of what you're looking for, or what you would want to connect with us about. Is it research? Have you been in a class with us previously? And you want to you would want a letter of recommendation for graduate school or for scholarships or for, other things that you're applying for. Or do you want to pursue independent research? Maybe, thinking about a particular area of interest that you have that aligns with something that you've seen on our website in terms of what we're focused on with our research, or you may have been in a class of ours and you felt like what you learned from our class sort of spark something in you to do some sort of independent research. And so you just want to be very clear in terms of what you're wanting us to follow up with you on. And like Dr. Davidenko said, if oftentimes faculty get a lot of emails. So if you haven't heard back from us in a week or two, you could follow up. Recently, I had a student's email go to my spam, and sometimes that happens. So I would recommend that you definitely follow up in terms of if you don't hear back from us in a while, right? And it's oftentimes we aren't, you want to be patient. We are sometimes more busy some weeks than others, and so some emails and we want to respond to you as be as helpful as possible. So sometimes it takes us a little bit of time to come back to your email. Another thing that I think is important is, you have email, but you also have if you're in a class with us, I always tell my students to pursue office hours with us, and not necessarily just about the topic of our course, but also if you're interested in anything else that we're doing in our research, right? And so, and also just, I've had students come to office hours just to ask me about my own trajectory and as to how I became a professor, or other aspects of my educational trajectory that they're interested in. And so you always are welcome to come to my office hours, to our office hours, and to join events like these, right? The departmental events. I highly recommend, every year we have an faculty advising fair at the beginning and in the fall quarter. I think in the past couple of years it's been around in like October or November, and that's a really nice space for you to connect with different faculty. We set up in a lawn outside of the department, and we're there for a few, I think for about an hour and a half at least, and anyone can come and connect with us at that faculty advising fair too. So things like that, definitely take advantage of events that your amazing peer advisors put on, so you can really start connecting with us.
Okay, so we have like 5 questions kind of prepared. So we'll kind of ask those first, and then we'll open it up for any other questions that students might have. But the first question is, when is it recommended to start getting involved with, with research?
Yeah, I'll jump in there. I mean, the earlier the better. Some faculty want you to have research methods like 100 before you enter the lab, that you might be able to contribute at a higher level once you have more knowledge under your belt about various research methods and you have a little bit of familiarity with SPSS. But I've also had students come into my lab at being very successful in their sophomore year. And then that 3 year span, they learn so much. And by the end of it, they're off, yeah, can be on publications, have been submitting to conferences, presenting at conferences. The more that you can take initiative, the better. So really like anticipating, hey, I want to go to graduate school. So usually the students that come into my lab early, they know that they want to go to graduate school. They have a really clear vision. And so they're able to kind of come in and hit the ground running, and they take a lot of initiative of finding, conferences to present at. And often we kind of integrate them into existing research that's already happening in the lab. But if you've been in the lab for already 2 years, especially your senior year, and there might be opportunities for you to start your own research project or take a little thread off of one of our projects and kind of take a lead in your own direction. And that's really great for building up your CV and getting into what is often very competitive graduate schools for research.
Great.
Yeah, and I would just
Oh,
add,
go ahead.
for transfer students, because there is, you come in as a transfer student, you probably are, a equivalent of your third year, right, in your junior year. And so I would recommend that transfer students start to look into what type of research they're interested in around that first quarter / second quarter. And I would recommend that they reach out and apply to research labs probably that winter of a quarter of their first year. I wouldn't wait until the second year of their transfer, because oftentimes that might be a little bit too late. So for transfers, it's a little more accelerated. So you would want to do that the first year that you transfer in.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that's been said. It really does vary by lab and by professor whether Psych 100 is required or not. So it doesn't hurt to ask. And if you're really motivated and interested in pursuing that, and even if you're a first year student, it doesn't hurt to reach out, because even if it doesn't work out right away to join a lab, at least you'll get some experience from going through that process of reaching out to a faculty and talking, and that faculty member will have you in their mind. So when you reach out maybe later, it'll feel familiar and sort of give you a leg up, I think. So and I would say for transfer students, I mean, it's hard to communicate this because they're still not here. But even finding out as before you are coming to UC Santa Cruz, to what the different research opportunities are in labs, and yeah, reach out as soon as you get here in that fall. I have recruited a lot of students through the academic advising fair that happens in the fall quarter outside of social sciences too. That's a good place to just meet faculty and introduce yourself in person. Um, so.
Great. And then we'll move on to the next question. What kind of roles or responsibilities do undergraduate research assistants take on in the labs?
I'll just continue what I was saying before. So, running participants and studies is one of the first things that they do in my lab. So, that requires doing some human subjects training modules that are like through the city training program, and then sort of getting trained by older RAs or by graduate students on the procedures of reading consent forms and running participants, debriefing, entering data. That's sort of like the basic task that everybody has to do at the beginning when they join the lab. And then the what really gets what really becomes useful for students is if they're thinking about graduate school or going on to a research career is the deeper involvement with projects that can come usually by being in the lab for a while and understanding more about the goals of a research project and finding ways that you can contribute either doing some reading and writing or doing some data analysis or contributing to ideas. And like Adriana and others have said, just being in the lab longer um, itself is like a good pathway to eventually get more involved if you're interested. So opportunities will come up more and more the longer you stay in a lab, usually.
Yeah, and I would say in my lab it varies a lot. It really depends on what projects are happening. We have a lot of different projects. So right now, and this year when I recruited new undergraduate RAs, they jumped into this interview data that I've had for a while with parents and adolescents in that indigenous community of Chiapas. We're now looking at after school came into the community, a communication tower came into the community. So now we've been looking at the role of mobile devices and social media and how parents are managing that and how values might be shifting as there are new opportunities for different kinds of social relationships with these communication technologies. So we had all these interviews transcribed, and we had three new undergraduates in the research lab, and we did a kind of a collaborative. It was very driven by undergrads' research interests as well. So this was kind of unusual. Oftentimes, I have a very clear, I don't know, hypothesis, research question. We're going to code in this way, but this was different. We did it sort of from the ground up thinking about, like, let's read through these interviews, what's coming up that's interesting to you that you want to pursue as a research question. So that was kind of unusual, but that might be one thing. Another time, yeah, we might be having, recruitment and data management, SPSS might be a kind of hitting the ground level or coming in with doing some like literature reviews. But it really varies. It totally depends on what projects are happening. We have a lot of different kinds of projects in our lab. So one student studying LGBTQ youth and social media, another student studying the development of critical consciousness and activism on social media. Whereas another person is interested in parenting and parenting like ethnotheories, beliefs and values about what children are like and what is the best way to raise children. So there's a lot of different kinds of projects in the lab, so it completely depends. But we do try to get undergrads involved in some way that's like interesting to them, so they're not just they may be just doing that for like a quarter, something that might not be as conceptually contributive, like just cleaning data in SPSS or recruiting. We try to by at least like the second quarter get undergraduates involved in something that is a little bit more conceptual and maybe writing and doing and definitely getting involved in like analyses.
Yeah, I think both Nick and Adriana have mentioned similar roles and responsibilities that my undergraduates have in our lab. I will say maybe mention something a little bit different because my lab we are involved with working in the context of like school settings, for example. Some of the undergraduate research assistant roles also include developing some sort of somewhat pedagogical skills or like how to teach. So one of our projects called Conexiones Culturales or Cultural Connections is a youth participatory action research project that we have in partnership with a middle school in Santa Cruz. And in essence, youth participatory action research is teaching youth to really understand the research process and to conduct research within their community on an issue that they feel like they is important to them and that they want to have voice and youth participation in it. And so in the context of the middle school, we also partner, because we have a partnership with this particular middle school, we also attend to the needs of the community partner, meaning what the school, what the parents would like our youth participatory action research to focus on or to incorporate. And so with that program, part of collecting data with the youth and with the school is also creating lesson plans for those sessions that we have with the youth. And so in that case, the roles and responsibilities of the undergraduates that are involved in that project is to really read and learn about and train through our lab around being a mentor to youth. And we go once a week to the middle school. The undergraduates have to go through a process to be able to be part of that middle school, or to be able to be in the middle school. And they also each week have to develop, lead an activity that is done with the youth that either builds their research skills or builds their around mentorship or around their leadership and youth participation. And so that is a little bit different from, I think, some more traditional responsibilities that an undergraduate research assistant would have in a lab. But I think it's also a type of research process that a lot of undergraduates really find enjoyable and worthwhile, in terms of sort of combining their what they're learning in the lab about collecting data in the field, because they also take ethnographic field notes, and also being a participant in the actual research itself as a mentor to these youth, these 6th through 8th graders.
Great. And then the next question is, are there specific skills a student should have or develop before applying to research opportunities?
Well, I guess I'll start in my lab. There are no specific skills that are required, but there are some skills that are like bonus to have. So some programming experience, for example, is super useful for my lab, because we do a lot of projects that involve computer programming for setting up experiments, for collecting data or analyzing data. Um, but on the other hand, I take lots of research assistants who don't have that background. Some of them develop it just being in the lab. Others don't, but they can still find other ways to contribute. So I don't think there's any particular skill that is absolutely required. But like I was saying earlier, having some experience and being able to express kind of like an interest in a research topic and explain why you're interested and how that fits in with your eventual goals and career goals, um, is more useful maybe than any particular skill.
I think one thing too, my lab, you don't necessarily have to have specific skills or even research experience, right? Because hopefully you'll be developing those experiences in my lab. But I do think one thing that oftentimes I ask students about when they fill out my lab application and they meet with me is really where they see them, how they see themselves using this research experience in their own professional development, and really wanting to understand like where research experience fits in their trajectory, right? And so I think as you all decide to apply or pursue a research lab experience, you really want to think about like why you want to do that, and also oftentimes it's graduate school, but also more specifically like why the lab that you're applying to, right? And so the other thing too is the students, in when they are researchers in my lab and other labs, there's a lot of like, you know, self accountability that you have. You get a research task and you need to accomplish it. So there's a lot of independent work that happens. And so really thinking about how you've handled that in the past, with just sort of getting a task and a deadline. And it's not as, it's not like a class where you have consistent, like, you meet twice a week or whatnot, and you have very specific types of assignments. In a lab, you could be doing anything from like, coding an interview to recruiting. There's so many different types of skills that you will develop as part of the research process, that you want to make sure that you have an understanding of what it means to work kind of independently, of course with the guidance of either myself or the graduate researchers, but it's a bit different. And so just feeling prepared to be able to have that responsibility, I think, is important.
Yeah, same thing here. There's not any specific requirements, any kinds of skills that you need to have to get into the lab. But I will often ask, so for example, the data that we're working with right now is all in Spanish. So I required Spanish speaking, native Spanish speaking was really important for this project. Oftentimes it's really nice to have people in the lab who have cultural experiences, either growing up in a different culture outside of the United States, for example. That's been really helpful because we really do try to center cultural diversity in our lab. And then this might be unusual, but having experience with social media is a real boon for our labs. We might not hear that very often, but people who are like involved in social media culture and understand like the memes and the, peer culture that's happening on TikTok can be really useful in our lab as well.
And then we'll have the next question. Um, are professors and TAs generally open to meeting outside of usually scheduled office hours?
Yeah, I think in general, office hours are oftentimes a specific day in the week, for, I don't know, anywhere from an hour to 2 hours. And that doesn't necessarily leave too much flexibility for some students if they can't make those hours. So at least in general, I would imagine that professors, faculty, are open to, making an appointment with you to fit your to be a little bit more flexible. I also oftentimes think teaching assistants do too.
Yeah, and it can also sometimes Zoom has been very helpful too if we're trying to figure out the right schedule. Like I tend to not be on campus on Fridays, but I can hop on a Zoom call. So um, yeah, that some flexibility and modality can also be helpful to meeting outside of office hours.
Yeah, I agree that yeah, if their office hours aren't convenient, just ask to schedule a Zoom meeting. It'll almost always work out.
All right. And then we have one more question. What kind of time frame should I give faculty or a grad student for a letter of recommendation? And then as well, if someone is like taking a gap year, when would it be a good time for them to request letters of recommendation?
Yeah, I think giving a little bit of space, what that might look like. I don't know. It's hard to say exactly, but definitely, not asking for a letter of rec that's due next week or even, tomorrow or something. Maybe, at least a few weeks ahead of time, I would say is maybe a good rule of thumb. Maybe, professor might be able to do it for you in a short time span, but it's sort of like showing respect and showing that you're planning, you're planful, that you're thinking ahead, that you're not just like impulsively applying to something and you all of a sudden need a letter of rec, showing that you have a plan, right? And that you're executing on this plan. It just goes a long way to show, yeah, your responsibility and your respect for the professor that you're asking the letter of rec from. And then, yeah, if you're taking a gap year, I would say, I guess at the end of the spring quarter, so before you go for your gap year, giving a heads up to the professor, the person that you're working with in their research, that hey, I'll be, my plan is to apply for grad school in the fall, so I'll be reaching out in the fall for a letter of rec. Yeah, the more planful you can be, the more you can think of it. And you don't have to have like an exact plan, right? I don't know exactly where I'm applying yet. But just giving your professor a heads up will go a long way in making that process smooth.
Yeah, and depending how well you know the professor or how much contact you've had or how long you've been in the lab, like those things can really affect sort of the nature of the letter that a professor will be able to write. So if you don't feel like you know the professor that well or you're not sure, try to schedule an in-person meeting to discuss more about that letter. You can definitely email them and mention that, you'd like to request a letter and this is your plan. You're planning to apply to master's programs or PhD programs or this year or next year. You kind of give a general outline, but then sort of offer or suggest the possibility of meeting over Zoom to hear more, especially if you don't know the faculty member that well, if you haven't worked for them for that long. The other thing I'd say is that there's some if you're applying, if you're taking a gap year, you might not be as familiar with the application process for grad schools. Um, Something that sometimes students don't know is that letters go through portals. So like professors don't send a letter to the student who then will send it off to graduate programs. The requests come from the application website to the directly to the professor who submits a letter directly. And the other thing is that once a professor is willing to write you a letter, a recommendation for a program, it's not that much more of an ask to tell them, oh, I think I'm going to apply to 5 programs and increase my chances to get in. It's not that much additional work for the faculty member. So don't feel the first ask can be a little nerve-wracking, but additional letters is not a big additional load because we can reuse most of that material.
And I'll just add really quickly, when students ask me for a letter of recommendation, I send them a list of materials that I would like from them, including a spreadsheet of all the schools that they're applying to and when the deadlines are, and who they're applying to work with, because those are things that all change in my general template letter for them to make it specific to all the programs that they're applying to. And that usually, I respond to the students with letting them know that I will need all those materials at least 2 weeks before the first letter is due. And so you want to, make sure that you fit it in your calendar to have time to create these materials. And I mean, the materials aren't necessarily extra. It's usually what you're already working on to like submit to your to the application that you're going to be doing for the graduate school programs. But just be aware that some faculty might ask for extra materials so they can write you the best letter possible.
All right. And then we're gonna kind of, I guess, open up the floor for any questions that students have. So feel free to put questions in the chat, or you can just unmute or raise your hand or whatever works for you.
Hi, I'm wondering if any of your labs have like summer opportunities, or if you think that that would be a thing like that a lot of psych labs might have. Thank you.
I personally tend to not, sometimes I do, but I tend to not have undergrad RAs in the summer. I think I only have done it once. I mean, it could change and variable, but it doesn't hurt to ask at all. I've actually had a few students reach out about this summer, and I'm going to be recruiting in the fall. So I just say, yeah, reach out again in September. This is the application. Look forward to hearing from you then. Yeah, there's definitely faculty who oftentimes summertime is an important time to get writing done, but other times, yeah, faculty are getting research done over the summer.
Yeah, I think it changes by summer and by professors or by even by projects. So definitely doesn't hurt to ask. Usually things slow down a lot over the summer, so even like a pretty active lab will slow down because there's just not as much flow of participants and grad students might not be around, and so um, it's slower. So it's usually not the best time for a new RA to join the lab because there's not enough people around to train and them and advise. But if you're already involved, then yes, ask about summer because it can be a good time to do some work with fewer distractions and stuff.
I have nothing to add. I agree with you.
I see there's some couple of questions in the chat. One is about generally how well should someone know a professor before asking for a letter of rec? Um, you know what it's really about like the quality of the letter. So if you don't know your professor very well, you've taken a big lecture class with them, and you didn't go to office hours, I tend to not write letters of rec for students that I haven't really spoken with one-on-one, because I just don't, I won't be able to write a strong enough letter. And these just, if my only experience with that student is in a big lecture class. If the student is really desperate, I might do it, but you have to keep in mind that it's probably not going to be enough of a strong letter to really boost your application. So for these graduate programs, they're pretty competitive. They're looking for someone who can speak to your work on a deeper level, not just like what grade that you got in the class. And so it sort of depends, like, if you're really desperate, sometimes, oftentimes it's like you need 3 letters. So if you have 2 really strong letters from people that you've worked with and you know really well, maybe that third letter, it's okay if it's a little bit shallow and you just need it to check off the box to get your 3 letters, and that might be okay. Yeah, I'd be curious to hear what other faculty in this Zoom think.
Yeah, I agree. But on the other hand, like, yeah, I think professors know that sometimes students need these letters and they don't have that many options. They haven't had as many opportunities to get to know faculty. So, um, if you did, if I, yeah, you haven't met or no, you don't know a professor well, but you did well in their class. It's worth asking if that's like sort of like the best choice you've had. The professor might want to briefly meet with you over Zoom or in person just to get to know you a little more and be able to say a little bit more than just they took my class, they did really well. This is what that means. Um, but um, but we get it that it's that sometimes that's your only choice, and we've been there ourselves. So um, yeah, it's still better than not having a letter, even if it's a shallow one, like Professor Manago was saying.
Yeah, I agree. And I think if you I would highly recommend meeting with them over Zoom or in person or whatnot, just for them to get to know you a little better. I also would recommend sharing any context in that email with them about what class you took with them, or if you haven't taken a class, why, you would, how would they connect with you prior to writing the letter. Usually, I mean, I think it's important to have at least had a class with them, even if it's a large lecture class. You can definitely, meet with them and talk a little bit about what you learned from the class and whatnot. And I think I agree with my colleagues. It's better to have something than nothing. I know some students have asked me, like, if they don't have a third faculty, or if they don't know the third faculty that they're considering for the 3 letters that are being asked for in their application, if they should ask a graduate student or a supervisor that they work with in another capacity. And oftentimes, one thing that I've recommended is maybe they can ask the graduate student because the graduate student knew them a little bit better, but know that, they should also ask the graduate student if they could co-write it with the professor. And oftentimes, I mean, I've done that where the TA knew the student a little bit better than I did, so we co-authored a letter together about the student.
Oh, I was going to respond to the other question that was posed. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but if the question is about inquiring or applying to a lab, um, I think that, the sooner is better option, and not everybody advertises open positions. As like I don't, for example, because I already get enough people reaching out to me, even by not advertising open positions. So don't assume that just because a lab opening is not posted anywhere that it doesn't exist or that the professor is not taking students. I don't know if that's what the question was about, but if it was, then that's what I would say.
Yeah, I agree. And again, like for example, I'm going to be looking to incorporate some new RAs in the fall, but it's great to have some students reaching out to me now because I know that okay, we've got some interest, and we can kind of hit the ground running as soon as September comes. Send me that application. Again, the more that you can show that you can take initiative, that you're really enthusiastic, that you're on top of it, the more likely you'll be to catch the lab director's eye, and create a kind of compelling story about yourself as someone who's going to be responsible, who's going to be a go-getter, who's going to be really enthusiastic about the research. So the sooner sooner that there's a lab that you really want to join, reach out as soon as you can, and you'll get information from the professor about where, when, and what the timeline is for projects, and when is the best time to send that application.
Yeah, I agree. The sooner you connect with the faculty director of a lab, the better. And don't be shy just because you don't see it advertised on their website or wherever, right? And just reach out. Part of the point of this, I think, of this event is really to share that we welcome students reaching out over email, reaching out over office hours, and any way that you feel like comfortable doing so, we will respond.
To that last question about how long to wait before following up, I would say like for me, like a couple weeks. So unless the question is more urgent than that, but if you're asking like, about a research position for like the following quarter or the following fall, I mean, yeah, yeah, 2 weeks is probably around the time. Um,
2 weeks.
yeah, and again, try to not take it personally if you don't hear back at first.
And then there's that question about if you don't get accepted to a lab, but you're still interested in joining that specific one. Um, Yeah, I think you can, reapply that next quarter, but it is definitely also a good idea to check out other labs. So you want to create, increase the probability that you can get into a lab, any lab, maybe not any lab exactly, but we don't expect you to get into grad school. We don't expect you to exactly be super specific and already know exactly what you want to research. The most important thing when you're an undergrad is to get a breadth of experiences. And that's kind of part of your exploration and figuring out exactly what you're interested in terms of research. So I would say if you don't get into one lab, explore other labs, as many as you can, the ones that are similar to your research interests. And then you could always apply again, and maybe your application will be even stronger because maybe you have more experience with another lab. Yes, I think that's important that sometimes students don't may not quite realize is that, yeah, when you're applying to grad school, we don't necessarily expect that you have done the exact research that you'll specialize in graduate school. So it's good to have a breadth of experiences as well, but also trying to hone in on, maybe like a highland joining Nick's lab and my lab might be very different kinds of experiences. Yeah, Professor Davidenko's lab. So maybe sort of getting in the ballpark, right? You want to be in a developmental lab, maybe try another developmental lab or another lab that has like similar methods or topics.
All right. And it's also just 10, so I know that,
Mhm.
the event is supposed to end. But I just wanted to say thank you so much for everyone who attended and for a great event. Uh, yeah.
Thank you for hosting.